Welcome to A Moment of Bach, where we take our favorite moments from the composer's vast musical output, just a minute's worth or even a few seconds, and show you why we think they are remarkable. We are your hosts, Alex and Christian Giebert, and today we look at Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, the Fugue in C minor. Harpsichordist Masato Suzuki describes this fugue as expressing the emotions of sadness, loneliness, and melancholy. But he also says at the end of the Netherlands Bach Society companion video interview that if you were playing the entire book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, so prelude and fugue, and then prelude and fugue, and so on, in all these different keys, it would be like a great journey, but this fugue would be like the first step on that journey. And I think we can explore what he means by that only if we get really into the subject of this fugue, but also first a bit of context. So if you know anything from this Well-Tempered Clavier, it's the very opening. It's the prelude in C major. Which is essentially a keyboard exercise, but it has such a beautiful character and flow to it that it has stood the test of time and become one of Bach's most played and most heard examples, even though it essentially has no melody. But it is a little bit like a nice, comforting home base to start in. And we're going to get a prelude and a fugue in all of the different keys. So we start in C, which is a nice place to start. It's home, let's say. We have C major, a prelude and fugue. Elegant and gorgeous fugue in C major, which opens with a melody that steps upwards with a range of the fourth from the bottom to the top of its shape. We'll come back to the idea of the fourth when we get to our moment today. And then another quite famous part of this work is the following prelude, which is the prelude of our fugue today, which is the prelude in C minor. Bach goes from major key to minor key for each of the sections of the Well-Tempered Clavier. This one is certainly a lot more passionate and declamatory, but wouldn't you say, Alex, that this one is basically the same musical texture, or at least let's say the same musical concept as the first one, the first prelude? The first prelude is essentially a series of chords in a row, the prelude in C major. And then this one is very similar. It doesn't sound at all the same because it's in minor. The texture is different. It's much busier, and it has a little more of a melody on the top if those strong beats seem melodic. Yeah, that's true. But it does feel, as you say, just kind of like a keyboard exercise that also happens to be like a coherent piece of music. Yeah. Basically an etude. Yeah, it does feel that way. And we know that the first prelude was exactly that when it started as part of Bach's compiled educational notebooks for his son. So we've begun with a place of comfort with the C major prelude and the fugue. And then we've ventured out a little bit into this imposing prelude, which has a lot of character to it. and it's very bold and intrepid. I see this as the character resolving to leave. Now we have the centerpiece of today, the fugue in C minor. If this is the first step on a journey of all the pieces in the Well-Tempered Clavier, this might be the moment where the adventurer begins to understand the dangerous scope of the whole thing. It gets a little more emotional and, as Suzuki says, perhaps lonely or melancholy. I would like to focus my moment of Bach on the very beginning. It's when the fugue is the most simple. As fugues get going, they get more complicated as the voices layer. So let's focus first on when we just hear one thing, and that will be called the fugue subject. And this one is, Bach just dialed it in so perfectly that the rest of the fugue is made of material from just this subject, which is not always the case in his own fugues. The first thing is essentially this little Baroque mordant figure. The construction of this subject is very deliberately divided into three. So we have a lower note that is descending. And there's 4 steps there. So my sort of pet theory here is that the prelude and fugue of number 1 in C major and number 2 in C minor are just intentionally connected as opposites, and that's why the number 1 and number 2 have this relation. Not sure about opposites, but definitely a strange communion between the two, because you have the subject of the C major fugue going up, and then you have this one with those 4 notes stepping down. Those pitches actually, if you transpose them, would be the same. So this interval of a fourth, or that is 4 steps in a row, is somehow important to both of these fugues. And then the idea of 3, at least Suzuki believes, is important to this as well, in that there's 3 flats. There's 3 flats in the key signature of C minor. Bach liked to include numerical symbolism in his music. There's also a 3-section nature of this subject motif. That mordant thing happens 3 times. Happens 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, and it's just it's a 3-note motive also.
Mm-hmm. And we have a 3-voice fugue. And also, we have 3 building blocks of this fugue, if you believe that there are, which I'm not sure every analysis is this way, but I know mine is, and I know others who agree with me. That is to say that there's a subject and 2 countersubjects. I think this is the perfect example of what a countersubject is. I'll just read a definition from the Kent Kennan Counterpoint book. A countersubject is a melodic idea that appears consistently along with the subject in the exposition, that is, the beginning, from the second announcement on, since the first is normally unaccompanied, and later in the fugue as well. It must also have melodic interest, individuality, and enough rhythmic contrast to make it a good foil for the subject. Yet, the 2 must make a natural and satisfying combination. The 2 must belong to each other. I like that poetic description. It also says a countersubject and its subject must also be invertible. That is, each must work well as upper or lower voice. I'm not saying it needs to be flipped around melodically inverted. I'm saying one of them could be on the top, the other one could be on the bottom, and vice versa. That's a requirement. Right.
And we have our countersubject here as soon as we hear the second voice enter. Because in this fugue, the first voice to enter is in the middle range. We'll call it the alto range.
When the second voice enters in the soprano, the top part, we hear a fast descent in the alto part, and then a more stepwise thing. That's the countersubject. And then, as we prepare for the third entry to come, after a little bit of subject motif fragments, this little transitory area which is made up of fragments of the subject. Then here, this is measure 7 if you're following along with music. Coming into measure 7, the alto voice apparently is about to start the subject again, sneaking ahead. We'll call it the bass entrance, the third voice, the bottom one. I'm talking about what the alto does right before, one beat before.
Yes, that's cool.
Yeah. It's kind of a fake out. We call this a false entry. Exactly the perfect name for that. And this is the textbook example of a false entry, by the way. When the bass part enters, just like all the other parts, it enters with the subject. Now, the soprano part has the countersubject. The alto part now, which is the part that entered first, is still there. So we have 3-part harmony here and linear melody as well. The alto part, which seems like it's attached somewhat to the soprano part here. You could either say is just kind of doing its own thing here, or you could call it the second countersubject, which I believe it is, because it appears later the same way. And that's the reason why it is really kind of that simple. It happens at measure 12 in the alto voice. And then it happens in the bass part at measure 15-16. It's characterized by a rest on the beat and then the note following off the beat.
The descending line.
And quite simply, with those 3 parts combined, a subject, a countersubject, and a second countersubject, you basically have this fugue. Everything is generated from that first subject, including the countersubjects, and then the countersubjects combine with the subject, and sometimes are inverted, actually melodically inverted, flipped over.
Yeah, I mean, if measure 9 in the bass has that descending line, and then it like does a little quick up and then falls back down. Through that whole measure, and then in 14 you can see that the soprano line does the exact same thing upside down. On its way up to a high note, to a high C.
9 and 10 is what's being flipped into 13 and 14. The bass part in 9 and 10 is being turned into and flipped over and becoming the soprano part in 13 and 14. It even has that wide leap of an octave and a fourth. And there's a fourth again. These spans of fourths are happening all over the place.
It's such an interestingly compact form in itself, the fugue. Like, you have to create little pieces of music that fit together in so many different puzzle piece kind of ways that the form itself is a work of art. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it's a communal work of art that composers had sort of over the course of time formalized into the sort of rule set that it had at the time of Bach. And the prevailing opinion is that Bach is the master of fugue. That's not a controversial opinion, but it's cool because he takes this, he's really doing is perfecting something that was already pretty well honed. This is not a amazing analogy, but it's kind of less like a physical sport, track and field or soccer or something, and more like NASCAR, like race car racing, where it's like the fugue is the car. It like already is a complex engine. If you can drive it really well, then you can be the best at it, but there's already an amazing amount of technological invention that has already been made to make it run the way it does. And I think the fugue is like that. Fugue is car. In conclusion,
I think car is polyphony, and like the inventors of the car are those Renaissance and medieval composers who championed imitative counterpoint. And then, as the no pun intended, richer car,
race car,
got a little more complicated into
racing car.
This is all staying in, you know that.
Yeah, of course.
Into more of an academically complicated thing, and then I think that's when the car becomes like the race car, the richer car, and then the fugue, which, by the way, fugue means fly.
Yeah.
Going fast is part of it, and this fugue does have, with all of its fast 16th notes, it does have that character to it. So yeah, I think it's the race car, and then you're saying that Bach is the driver because he is taking advantage of a form, a structure that does exist, that people have invented and perfected over many years, but he's the best at it, so he's like the Dale Earnhardt Jr. is what you're saying.
Oh, yeah, I'm saying Bach is Dale Earnhardt Jr.
Yeah. Wow. I don't know what to do with that information.
The well-tempered Chevrolet. I don't know.
Well-oiled clavier.
Yeah, there you go.
One delightful choice by the performer Suzuki is the way that he chooses to articulate the subject. Those 3 parts of the subject, he does them differently. I don't think I've ever heard a performance that was quite this distinct, but take a listen to that beginning one more time. Did you notice that each 3 subject segments has a different articulation? And it more or less continues that way as long as the fingering works out conveniently for him to do that. Definitely the first one is the short one. The second one sounds like it's also separated but long. And the third one is just completely connected. Later on, it's hard to tell if there's actually a difference between the second and the third one. But the very first opening subject, because it's so easy to hear, because it's alone, that's where it seems the most obvious. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
But he is doing it at least at the next entrances, the first entrances of each voice. He is doing it there. It's cool. It's a cool choice, and I didn't notice it on the first go around. But it fits intuitively into the puzzle, so it's a good choice. Articulation is kind of an underrated performance skill to be able to do that well, especially in Baroque music, to be able to make the choices that might not be as dictated for you in the musical score.
Yeah. It's absolutely a part of Baroque music that is not notated.
Well, except for the slurs and stuff Bach would add, but I guess that's more bowing instead of articulation. Like he adds bowing slurs to the cantata string stuff.
I guess that's true.
Not always, but a lot.
There's a couple of wind parts that have slurs in them too.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
You don't really see very many staccato markings. He did write stuff like that. It's just he wrote a lot less than we do now. When you prepare a score nowadays, you just have to put in exactly what you want. And in his time, that just wasn't the case. So the way that Suzuki is performing it here, I think, goes along with his argument of this thing being based on the number 3, but also it gives the subject, I think, a much more intentionally strange character. It's just not so obvious when you don't play them all the same. It's not obvious that they're even connected. I think it distinguishes each little part of the subject, each little fragment.
It does. And they're really thorny. This particular fugue subject is really thorny. It's minor. It has that do-do-do-do. It just has the typical thing that minor has when you have leading tones, the do-ti-do thing. The fact that those notes are altered in minor give it a little thorniness. The sort of spiky quality of the staccato on a harpsichord in particular, because I think this sounds too pretty on piano. Of course, it was intended for harpsichord or maybe clavichord or something like that. But yeah, but the articulation choice, of course, also adds to that quality. But with the thorniness of this comes that probably sense that Suzuki's talking about, where it gives you that sense of unease, the setting out on a journey thing, because it doesn't feel very grounded. It starts on an offbeat. It's not like the contrasting fugue that you mentioned in C major. Not only is that major, so it feels more grounded, but it's also like starting on the tonic pitch, just going up. And of course, that feels a lot more built on the foundation.
And it's just so much prettier and nicer. It doesn't embody the etymology of the word fugue, which is like to run away or running, but this one does. This one is a fugue in the literal sense. And what a great opposite it is to its prelude, which is so firm on the beats. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. And this one is nothing on the beat, and it's just ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's just so different. That principle of opposites, the prelude versus its fugue, this prelude and fugue versus the previous one, the previous prelude and fugue, the difference between C major and C minor, the concept of the countersubject being the foil for the subject, the duality of that. It's a very rich musical principle. And even in this kind of tiny, quick piece, there's just so much packed into it.
And now, here is that moment, the beginning of Fugue number 2 in C minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. If this introduction to the Well-Tempered Clavier has inspired you to check out more of these preludes and fugues, good news, listener! The Netherlands Bach Society has you covered. They have recorded all 24 of Book 1 and all 24 of Book 2. That's 12 preludes in each key and 12 fugues in each key, a whole other set of preludes and fugues of Book 2. And then, if you want to keep hearing us talk about Bach, then thank you. Thanks for listening. And the best thing you can do is to tell other people about the podcast. And the second best thing you can do is to give us a rate and review on whatever podcast player you have, because that also helps other strangers find our podcast.
Okay, so what's up for next episode?
I'm working on preparing BWV 106, Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, otherwise known as Actus Tragicus, for a concert next year. And as one of our favorites, listeners, if you've listened for a while, you know we've talked about it twice already. An incredible early work by Bach. Absolute masterpiece. We'll look at a movement from that we haven't discussed yet. It is one of the inner movements, kind of near the end. There's a bass aria, which features an alto chorale above it. We'll look at one moment from that alto chorale.
Until next time, enjoy those moments.
Fugue is car.